So hello everybody, my name is Ryan Cahela. I am a student at a coding bootcamp at Thinkful, and I decided to do this talk just because I wanted to try to learn the basics. I already know the basics, I think. Sometimes I think I do. But I just wanted to, I'm still also a beginner. I consider myself a beginner. I've been coding for about 5 years as a hobby. So I'm a coding bootcamp student, like I said. I've been building websites as a hobby for about 6 years or so, still learning stuff. I'm currently looking for work as a junior developer, so if anybody knows any opportunities, let me know. And like I said, I'm still learning. I don't feel, that's the one thing I love about web development, is that I feel like you never know everything. So it's good to just keep learning, and it never gets boring, which is the fun part. And that's my portfolio site, if anybody wants to take a look. So basically, what you can expect here is I'm just going to go over kind of like, I want it to be like, how does JavaScript sort of fit into this picture of web development? Like, there's so many different technologies, so many different acronyms. I wanted to sort of just paint a picture of like where it fits in the ecosystem, and particularly in the DOM, which is the document object model, which is how the browser sees your web page. It's how it breaks it up. So first we're going to just go over real basic how the internet works. Then we're going to go over some just basic data types and how to store them in variables in JavaScript. And then I'm going to do we'll do a quick challenge to just write an actual program yourselves. I don't want this to just be like a lecture. Like I want it to be social, because we all came here to meet people and talk to each other. So we're going to do a quick challenge there. That'd be maybe about 5 or 10 minutes. And then we're going to talk about objects, which are a really important thing in JavaScript. Not everything in JavaScript an object, but most things, especially in web pages, are objects when it comes to JavaScript. Then we're going to talk about functions, and then we're going to talk about how all that stuff relates to the DOM, and then we're going to do some fun coding stuff with animations. So let me just I'll just leave it for later. Later we're going to do some cool animation stuff with colors, and it'll be pretty fun. So real quick, this is about as deep as I'm going to get in how the internet works. So basically, everything on the internet is just computers talking to computers, right? So at any given time, most of the computers you interact with are acting as clients. So this would be like a laptop, your cell phone, or anything else. Your computer could also be a server, but unless you set it up that way, it's most likely acting as a client. So for an example, you log onto Google's web page. Your computer, whatever computer you're using with a browser, sends a request to Google server. Google server then sends back an HTML page, which we'll go over what HTML is. It sends that back to the client and says, here's the web page. So that's about as basic. Servers are computers that usually live in office buildings like this one, with a bunch of teams of people that are maintaining them and making sure they're fast. So my favorite analogy for a web page, like what is a web page, is a web page is like a house. So in a web page, you have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Those are the technologies that make up a web page. The first one is hypertext markup language. So if the HTML is there to describe what the data is. So it's sort of like information about the data. It annotates your data you have, like where it belongs, not where it belongs on the page, but what it is and how it should be treated. So in our analogy, the HTML would be like, in our house would be like the wood floors, not the wood floors, the walls, the wood, like the things, the floor plan, the things that describe what room is what, like see the dining room, living room, the bathroom and stuff. So it's like, what is this room? What's it for? It has nothing to do with what it looks like though. So just imagine like a house under construction that is just completely bare. That's what the HTML is. It's very basic. And I don't know if you noticed, I put in some construction fail photos there. So there's like a office building with a door in the middle of nowhere. So this is what HTML looks like. I don't know if you guys can you guys see this? Yeah, you guys have freaking projectors everywhere. So this is a basic HTML page. Notice how I just wanted to sort of convey like what it is that's like see, we have like a navigation here. So these would be our like a navigation link. So it's describing what this information is. Like this is a nav. We have a main section here, so this would be like our main content. We have a footer, so it's describing what the information is, because otherwise it would all just be text. These are also called attributes here, is href, so these would be link tags. These are how you make links, and then it just goes to a website, like you put the URL of the website there in the href attribute, and it sort of will link to the other web page. So CSS would be how the information should look. So going with our house analogy, it's sort of the carpets, what color are the walls, are there fans, all that kind of stuff, what kind of furniture goes in the room. That would be our cascading style sheets. So this is pretty much a lot of websites, some of them don't even need JavaScript. You can have HTML and CSS, and like a simple restaurant website with just a menu, you don't really even need JavaScript. You can have a pretty nice looking house with just HTML and CSS. None of the faucets will work or anything, but it'll still be pretty good. So this is what it looks like, kind of embedded. This is just the CSS part right here. The rest of it's HTML. I embedded it in the HTML, so it could be so you can see sort of in context. And then this is slightly different HTML than what you saw before, but this HTML tag, or this CSS tag, is targeting this attribute. This is a different attribute. It's an ID attribute. And notice these two match up. So this is selecting this, and notice that it's making the background red, and it's sort of giving it some dimensions of 200 pixels. I'm defining how it should look, because otherwise it would just look kind of normal and plain like the other one did with just the HTML. So JavaScript is how the information should behave. So in the house, it would be the plumbing or the wiring. It would be how to make these things work. So with HTML and CSS, you could have a really nice kitchen, and it would look really nice, but the faucet wouldn't turn on, the stove wouldn't turn on. So JavaScript adds those functionalities to the house, and with all three together, we get a really nice house. So that's my favorite analogy for a web page. And then down here, again, most of this is HTML. Inside of our script tag here, we just have a simple JavaScript statement, and I'm going to go over what all this means later. But just for an example, if you could see what it looks like, we're just selecting this element here. We're using the getElementById selector to select this element. So both of these, the CSS and this HTML, or sorry, this JavaScript, select this header. Okay, so I want to just a quick preview of how all this stuff is going to fit inside. Like once we go over the basics of JavaScript, I want you to get an idea of how all of this kind of fits together. So in JavaScript, like why all this kind of not boring, but really kind of dry material I'm about to go over is important to know for later. So the document object model is how your browser views your website. So what it does, it goes through, when your browser receives this from like a Google server or something, it goes through and it breaks these down into what are called DOM nodes, which are basically just JavaScript objects. So basically, it'll just create a tree almost of these different nodes, just like this. So you see we have the document is at the top. That represents the whole web page. Then we have like an HTML, like we just saw there. We have the head and the body elements. And then it kind of just goes down from there as like a tree. And that's how it views your website. But they're all JavaScript objects. So that's why it's important to know how to work with JavaScript, because if you can work with JavaScript, you can manipulate these different objects and change the different properties on them to change things on your web page dynamically. So basic data types in JavaScript. There are actually 7 data types. I'm just showing 6 here. There's a 7th one called symbol, which is new in ES6. I'm not including it here because it's kind of complicated, and to be honest, I don't fully understand it. So I'm just going to go with the 6 here. And you don't really need to know how symbols work right off the bat to know how to use JavaScript. You don't need to know a lot of things to know how to use it. JavaScript's a very forgiving language, which is actually one of the things I like about it. So basically, we have strings, which are just text. They sit inside of quotes. We can have double quotes or single quotes. We have numbers. JavaScript only has one number type, which is easy. Works just like you would think. You can do math with it. We have Boolean types, which is just a data type that can either be true or false. It can be one of these 2 values, and that's it. We have a value called undefined, which is to sort of denote a non-value, essentially. So it'd be like if you had a variable, I'll go over what variables are in a second, but it's to denote that there isn't any value there. The same thing kind of goes for null, actually. It's weird in JavaScript. We have 2 empty values almost. I tend to stay away from null because it's kind of glitchy, and I'll show you in a second why. I just stick with undefined. But those are both basically the same. Undefined, the data type, there's only one value that undefined can have, and it's undefined, that data type. Same for null. So they're pretty simple. Objects, like I said, we'll cover in a little bit. So we can pretty much just take those off the table right now. And we're just going to focus on these three. These are the big three. These are called primitive data types. So, like I said, strings and quotes, numbers, and true and false. So we'll talk about strings real quick. This is the type of operator. It's what's called a urinary operator. So it only needs one thing to operate on. It operates on this string, and when JavaScript sees this, it evaluates it, and then it's going to spit out a quote string. And now, yeah, the type of operator always returns a string. So right here, it's just going to be type string, but I'll show you in a second. With numbers, it returns a number in quotes, and the same with Booleans. So we can concatenate strings. This plus sign is what's called a binary operator. So it needs two things to operate on, one on the left and one on the right. And so we can, what's this called string concatenation. So it just takes the two and combines them into one word. String, hello plus 2, JavaScript is smart enough to know that you can't really add a number to a string. So, and the plus sign likes to concatenate strings. That's one thing to remember with the plus sign. So it likes to concatenate strings. So what JavaScript is actually going to do, it's going to change this from a number type into a string. So it's going to change it to the string 2, and then it's going to combine them, just like it did up here, to hello 2. That's what's going to happen. Same thing for the true. So if we try to add a string to a Boolean, we also get hello true. Same for numbers. Numbers are pretty easy. It's just your simple addition, subtraction, division, multiplication. This is called the modulo operator. It returns the remainder. So 42 divided by 2 is 0. It's really useful for telling if numbers are even or not, but that's about it. I haven't found any other uses for it. Maybe someone could tell me one. If you look here, type of 42 returns number. So I just wanted to use the type of just to sort of demonstrate what urinary operators are. Same thing with true and false, returns Boolean, and true and false just evaluate the true and false. They're pretty simple. If you'll notice, this is a comment in JavaScript, just so you know. // this is a comment, and that's why I left those. Anything in a comment will be ignored by the JavaScript engine. Same thing with undefined and null, same thing. This is why null is kind of glitchy. If you do type of null, it returns object. And null is not an object, it's null. So this is actually a glitch that was built in JavaScript the first couple days when they were building it. And because JavaScript decided that they're always going to be backwards compatible, they can't take it out of the language. So we're kind of stuck with it, which is why a lot of people just stay away from null and just use undefined instead. They're both negative values. Some people use null to denote that I'm intentionally leaving this space empty, but you could also just do it with undefined. But you might come across that in code, that some people use it like that. Same thing, they just evaluate to their types. So quick pop quiz. Who knows what this is going to evaluate to? Line 2. Anybody? String, string. Yep. What about 5 plus 5? These ones are easy. 10. Yep. 5 plus string. 5 string. 5 plus undefined. I didn't go over this one. Anybody? Not necessarily an error. It'll return something. Anybody? Not undefined. Good guess, though. No. That's also a very good guess. It is. It's going to be not a number. So the reason this is because JavaScript, like I said, it likes to concatenate strings. So here it sees there's a string, the plus sign, JavaScript doesn't, the plus sign does. So here it sees a string. So it says, oh, I have a string here. I'm going to change 5 into a string. Down here, it doesn't see any string. There's an undefined and a number. So if there's no string, it's like, okay, I'm going to do some math then. I'll add them together. So I need to have two numbers to add them together. So it has the 5, that's fine. It tries to convert undefined to a number, and it fails because what number does undefined become? It doesn't make sense. It can't be anything. You can't make it 0 because 0 is a very real number. So this is just an empty value. So what it's going to do is it's going to fail in that conversion. It's not going to be able to convert it to a number. And whenever JavaScript fails in a conversion, especially fails in a number conversion, it returns not a number. It's kind of a bad name for it. It should be invalid number or something like that, to that effect, because it's actually still technically, if you do type of nan, it returns number. But so it's going to fail. So if any time in your programs, if you're writing code and you're getting nan back as a result, it means that there was a failed math conversion somewhere. It means JavaScript saw something that wasn't a number, tried to make it a number, and it failed. And so anything that returns nan plus 5 returns nan. Nan with anything returns nan. So that's a quick thing about nan. Good tip. String minus string, what's that going to do? Anybody? No? Good guess, though. Very good guess. Could be. Remember, the plus sign concatenates things, but the subtract sign doesn't do that. It's just the plus sign that concatenates strings. That's one separate thing. It's not like math. So it's not doing math. That's string concatenation. The minus sign is only doing math in JavaScript. So what's going to happen is it's going to try to do math with this, and it doesn't make sense. So it can only do math with numbers. So it's going to convert a string, try to convert a string to a number, and what do you think it's going to get? Nan, exactly. It's going to try to convert that to a number, the other string to a number, and it's also going to get nan. Nan minus nan is nan. Yeah. So it's just remember with the plus sign, only the plus sign only has that capability of doing with the strings and the numbers. The negative, the minus sign is only doing math. True plus true, this one's a bit of a trick question. I didn't really go over it. Any ideas? 2 trues? Or 2? Yeah, it's going to be 2. So JavaScript's kind of weird, actually. When it tries to convert true or false to numbers, true evaluates to 1 and false evaluates to 0. This is an old thing from C. I get when they don't have Booleans, they used 1 and 0 to represent true or false. So that's what that is going to do. Because remember, they're not strings, they're Booleans. So if there's no string, it's going to try to convert them to numbers. And this time it's going to be successful and put it in as 2. Oh, whoops, I went too far on that one. This is the, accidentally clicked. So this is the logical not operator. It's going to take any Boolean, it's going to flip it around. So true becomes false. That's basically it. It's also another urinary operator, just like the type of operator. So you only need to have it on the one side. And then false plus string, any ideas? False string, yep. It's going to convert that to a string. How you guys doing? Am I going? Is everybody feeling all right? All right, cool. So these are how we store values and variables. Because all of these things have evaluated, but they kind of just disappear into nothing. We need to store them, we need to capture those values in variables. So this is how we create a variable. We use a let keyword. It is initialized to undefined. Remember how I was saying undefined signifies an empty container. We're just making a container here. We're making random name container. You can name it whatever you want there. Here, we're using the equal sign, another binary operator. It's a very important operator. It assigns things to whatever's on the left-hand side. So you can think of it as like target, source. So we have a string Jeff, and we're going to put it inside of the variable. We're going to assign from the source to the target of the variable. And so now random name is holding the string Jeff. All right, and this is a shorter hand version of it, where you can just make it on one line, define the variable, and then input the string into it. So we can treat variables like values, which is actually really useful and pretty powerful. So here we're just going to pretend we have like some kind of game. We can store the score in a variable, and we can also have a Boolean. User has top score, something. Booleans are really good, useful for storing like state or different things if something has happened or not. Then we can just pretend there's a bunch of code in between here, and pretend the user does something that scores 500 points. So the way we increment it is we can assign score with the value of score plus 50. Remember, this is just as good as 20, but we don't necessarily know. They could have scored, there could have been something else in the game where they scored more points. So instead of putting 20 here, we can just put score. So in case the score at this point is, say, 40, it could be 40 plus 500. So it's a really good way of sort of making your code a little more flexible. And then we can also set the false to a true to flip it around if, say, they got the high score. So this is how you do basic input in JavaScript, very basic input. You can use this prompt function. We'll go over, like I said, we'll go over what functions are later. But you can use this to pretty much make this display, like on the top. I don't know if you've ever seen it, like an alert or something on the top of your browser, and you can input something in there. And then whatever you input there will be returned from this prompt and get stored in the variable. So it's a way you can ask, it's a really simple way you can ask the user for some kind of input. But we also have to make sure to define a variable to capture that value we get from them. We have alert, which is a basic output. You can write whatever you want in between the parentheses to be alerted out. So like I'm saying, your message here, I'm passing in a string, we get your message here. Like it's going to be output. So that's just basic input and output. You can also put variables inside of there. So that's a big hint for the next challenge we're actually about to do. So we're going to talk about algorithms real quick for a second. And algorithms used to be a word that scared me a lot because it sounded really fancy and scary and complicated. But these are the, this is the definition I got, textbook definition for it. It seemed really flowery, and it's got a bunch of different flowery language in it. So I decided to take that out. An algorithm is a process to be followed in problem-solving operations. That's all an algorithm is. So we can build an algorithm just for a basic input, output of we want to ask the user for for their name, and then we want to output what they put in, essentially, and say hello. So what do you think the algorithm would be for that? Like, let's just write an algorithm real quick as a group. Like, what do you think the first step would be in that algorithm? To ask a user for their name and then output it on the screen. Yep, that's first step one. We make a variable.
Percent sign text here with the variable and the end of the percentage string?
I think you said, yeah, that prompt I showed you where it asks the user for the input. Yep, that's right. That's the second one. So we define a variable, and then we ask the user for their input, and then what would be the third step in that? We could console log it. Yep, that's one thing. Before we do that, though, what do we need to do with the value the user gave us? Yep, that's it. That's step 3. We need to actually assign the value to the variable. We have to just think about it in steps like that, where we get it from the user, and then we have to assign it to the variable. And then what would be the fourth step? Output it, right? You already mentioned it. So we would just output it. So there we go. So this would be just like the first challenge real quick of just kind of writing a quick program of, I did the algorithm here, and then this is just a quick cheat sheet for it. So if you guys want to take like 5 minutes and do it, and work with, partner up maybe or something, I don't know, just talk to each other. I don't want to, I just want it to be kind of social. So we could do a quick, just write this out. If you guys think it's too easy, you can just kind of gab for. So this is CodePen. If anybody hasn't seen it before, it's a really cool, useful website. You can just go on it, and they have your whole environment set up here. So you can write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If you're going to do this particular one, I'm going to go to the settings, and if you go to behavior, and click, you undo the auto refresh. So now you have to click run. All right, so I'm going to talk about objects. Like I said, objects are, okay, wait, it would go away. Objects are a very important thing in JavaScript. They're very useful, but they're not as complicated as they might seem. They're basically just collections of data. That's all it is. It's just a collection of data that has some sort of meaning. You want to use objects. Objects are usually used to sort of model something in the real world. In the DOM or in your browser, they're used to model the different HTML elements. But you can use them to model pretty much anything. This is how you create an empty object. You just use the brackets there. It'll create an empty object. And is everybody here familiar with the console? Like how to use the console in your browser? Does anybody not know what the console is? Okay. So this is the output from it. It's just an empty object. This is how you can see. You can use this console.dir, which is good for printing out objects because it actually gives you a drop down of what's inside the object. This is an empty object with just a single property on it, this underscore proto thing. I'm not going to go into what that is, but it's a really cool feature in JavaScript. But this is an empty object. So like I said, we can use it to model things in the real world. We can use it to model cars, like the number of wheels the car has, the number of passengers. We could also use it to model a person. So here I'm modeling a person named Shaggy. I have an age, We have a Boolean property. So you'll see how we use our data we just learned about, our data structure, not data structures, our data types. We can use it to sort of model different pieces of information inside of our objects. And like I said, so here we can see that it actually outputs the properties on the object. It reorganizes them to be alphabetical, but that's it. So that's how you can view the insides of the object. Basically, I'm just showing you this, so later when we actually code and I show you DOM objects, it's not as intimidating. It just looks like this, but just with a lot more properties on it. So this is just what an object looks like in the console. It's just this. So we can also have objects be properties on objects. And this is where a lot of the power comes from building the DOM, is these objects connected to other objects. So we can have a dog property with another object with its own properties on it. So we have Scooby, age 4, wants snacks, set to true. You can have anything you want. These can be any length, all right? And then this is how we can view it in the console also. So the way we access things inside of objects values is we use what's called the member operator. It's this dot here. You've probably seen this before if you've ever looked at code. It's very important. It's one of the most important concepts to get in really any type of JavaScript code or a lot of code, any C-based code. We access it with the dot. So we say the object, and then it's dot property. So object dot property is how you access the different pieces on the object. So here we're saying person dot name. If we want to access the rest of these, we could say person dot something else. So any idea what person.age would return? 25, yep. Oh, person.found the ghost. False, yep. What about person.dog? Object, yep. Return an object. What about person.dog.name? Scooby, right? Now what if we take person.age, we can reference the object and the value in there, and then actually reassign to it. So we can reference this person.age, which was 25. This evaluates to 25, and we can add 1 to it, and then assign it to the variable. So the value of this, after all of that, would be 26. And then we can do the same thing with the Boolean values on the object. We can reference that, set it to true, and now it's equal to true. Functions. I just really wanted to use this GIF. Functions are like dumb robots. Computers in general are like dumb robots. They'll do exactly what you want them to do, which is a good thing. The con is they'll do exactly what you want them to do, or what you tell them to do. So if you tell them to do the wrong thing, they're going to do that, and you're not going to get the results you want. So I'm just going to cover these really quickly. Functions, this is how you make a function. It's called a function declaration. Right now, this is an empty function. I just want to show you. You put the name of the function here, and JavaScript will create a function for you. Functions are objects, just essentially, at the end of the day. They're just objects that can do something. They're objects that can execute steps to do something. This is called a function expression, where we're actually making a variable with the let keyword. We're making a variable, right? And then we're assigning, with this equal sign, an empty function. This is called an anonymous function that you'll see. It doesn't have a name, you'll notice. But I wanted to do this, define them differently, just to show that you call them the same way. You call the function with the parentheses. All right? So other function, name of function, you call them the exact same way. I'm partial to these because function declarations, because you can define them anywhere in your code, and it will be available anywhere in your code, given that it's in scope, which is another topic. But these won't be available. Like if we had a reference to other function up here, if we tried to move this code up here, we would get an error because we haven't defined it here. This is only with function expressions. Function declarations, it could be down here, and we could call it up here, and it would work because these get what's called hoisted up to the top. That's why I like them a lot more. They're a lot more useful. You don't run into these problems with assigning them. But I wanted to show you that you can assign functions to things in JavaScript. This is going to be important later. Functions take parameters. We can define the parameters up here. And then those give us kind of hooks to something we can use inside of the function that once we pass these numbers into the function, they get assigned to these parameters. They're called parameters. And then we can do something with them. And then we can return out of the function a result to some sort of operation if we want to. Functions don't have to necessarily return something. If you don't define a return, they'll just return undefined. Same thing, I wanted to also show that you can pass in functions as callbacks. You can pass in functions to other functions and have functions call those functions. So we're going to do, just pretend that there's something in here to be done later, and then we're going to pass that in. Down here, we have the reference here. We're going to pass that into this event listener function. So it's going to be given the value of CB, and then we're just going to assume that it's going to wait for some kind of event to happen, like a user clicking on something, and then it's going to call that function. So that's the basic thing with the callback function, is that you can pass a function into another function and have that function wait through some logic. You'd have to write it. It doesn't do it automatically, but then you can have that call that function that you passed in. So this goes all the way back to the DOM. All right, so now we're going to get to the fun coding part. So like I said, when it goes through, when your browser gets the HTML page back from Google or any website you visit, it breaks everything down into what's called the DOM, the document object model. And it makes sense. The document is the top node, and then it's using objects, and it's modeling your web page. So the name makes sense. So it breaks everything down, all this HTML, into different pieces. So this is our basic HTML page. A quick tip. If you want to use CodePen, did you guys get on CodePen? Anybody wants to code along? Is everybody on CodePen? Everybody's good? All right. So I'm going to refresh. So right now, all we have is an H1 element and a button. And I have two IDs on those buttons. And then we have a div with an ID of output, right? So what we can do is actually, inspect it here. So we're going to open up our console here. Like I said, this is sort of a, this isn't the actual HTML. This is like a representation, I think, of the HTML that the browser received. But then we can open up console. Like I said, it builds just a big file of objects, essentially, a big tree of objects. So, and the root of that tree is the window object in your browser. So if you just type window in, it'll give you access to that object. Does this look familiar? It's an object. It's just a JavaScript object with a lot more properties on it. We also used earlier the alert function. That's available on the window object. That's what we used to make the alert. We also have the prompt down here. So that's the window object. One of the important things on the window object to make note of is this document property. And this is the document object. This is what the browser builds to be our web page. So if you'll look, you'll see that right now this URL is technically just a local file, but that's the URL to the web page, right? We have this body tag, which represents the body of the web page. So we have this property called child nodes. And so basically the HTML is described as a tree. A common thing we use in web development is like it's like a family tree. So the HTML would have two children. It would have a head tag and a body tag as its children. And then the same thing, those two elements would have children. Like the body tag has an H1 and a button and a div. So, and then these would be grandchildren of the HTML tag. So it's kind of just a way of describing these sort of hierarchical, like this tree structure of the web page. So you'll hear people say that a lot. So it's actually worked its way into the properties here. So we have child nodes, and you'll notice it's a big list, but there's our button. It's highlighting it right there. Oops. And there's our output. It's empty because there's nothing in there. Now, I can keep drilling in here and keep going, and you'll see they have a lot of the same properties. We also have another child nodes here, and we can keep looking, and that's just the text inside, but that gets kind of annoying and tedious after a while. So what we can do is we can actually use a couple of helper functions that the browser vendors give us to select things that are on the page. So inside of my HTML tag here, we can or HTML, we have a script tag. Inside of this script tag, we can run any kind of JavaScript we want on the page. So the first thing I want to do is grab this button. So let's go let button, make a variable to store it, equals document dot, what happened? Hold on. Equals document dot get element by ID. So this is a function that the browser vendors give us. And notice we gave an ID to these different elements. So we can match those up with the elements. So I can just say button. Because it matches that, it's going to go through the DOM and it's going to find that element for us. So we don't have to keep digging down into it. So it's going to pull that out and it's going to store it in the variable. And we can do the same for our output tag. So we can do output equals document dot get element by ID. So now we have our two outputs. So what I can do real quick though, just to show you what these look like, is I'm going to console.dir the button. So if I save this and then refresh the page, it's going to output our button here. And so again, it just looks like an object. They're all just objects. If we check the ID attribute, we'll notice we have our button string that we passed in, that we assigned to it in our HTML. We also have our inner text or inner HTML. It's just this make button text that we put inside. We're also going to be using the text content to specify the text inside of it. For some reason, there's a couple of properties. I'm not 100% sure why, but we can use text content to specify what's inside the element. So I'm going to keep that where it just keeps console logging the button. So what do we need to do? Oh yeah, let me show you this real quick. So with the button in any element really, you'll notice a lot of properties here. There's a lot of these are these on properties. So what these are event handler properties, essentially. We can assign functions to these properties, and then the browser is smart enough to know to wait to run these functions when that event happens. So there's a lot of different a lot of different events that can happen. These are just the events that can happen on this element. We have one here. This onClick is the one we're going to use right now. So when you click it, if we pass the function we pass into this property, it's going to wait and it's going to run that function once the user clicks on it. So if I were to say button.onClick, remember how that's all we need to do to access properties on an object is just use the period. So onClick, and we're going to assign that equal to a function. Function. And then right now I'm just going to have that function console.log that it clicked. Save that and refresh the page. And now nothing's going to pop up yet because that function's stored in there. But if I click the button, it's going to console log click. So it knows to run that function once the event happens. And if we check back on our button, we'll see the onClick now has a function on it that we just created. It's there. It doesn't have a name. We can actually, fun fact, you can give these names. Again, you can name it whatever you want. Save that. And now, if we double check the onClick, now it has a name, so we know that it's the exact function we assigned to it. So that's all fun. It's kind of boring though. So we'll actually do this. It's a make button button, or make box button. Actually, I called it make button. It should be make box. We're going to make a box with it. So what we're going to do, we're going to go let box inside of our function. Each time we click the button, we want it to make a box. So we're going to say let box. We're going to set that equal to another function that the browser vendors gave us called document.create element. If I can spell it right, element So what create element does is it makes a node for us. So instead of having to specify it in our HTML, we can just make it with JavaScript. And so as you see, we don't necessarily, sometimes you can just leave all this blank. You could do it all in JavaScript. So inside of the create element function, we need to pass it in a string that specifies the type of element we want to make. I want to make another div element. Div is just a HTML, it's a placeholder, or not placeholder, but it's just sort of a generic container element you can use. So I'm just going to use it to make a box. So we have it right there. We created it, but right now it's not doing anything. We just make it and it just kind of sits in memory. It doesn't get onto our page. So what we need to do is we need to grab our output, and we use another function that they gave us called append child. And then we pass in the box. So we're creating an element with this function. It's then getting returned from this function, and then we're passing that into the box with the equal sign there, right? This variable box. And then we're calling this append child function on output, and then we're passing in the box. So it knows to pass it inside of this div right here. That's exactly where it's going to get placed once we click the button. I'm going to save that, run it. And you're going to see, once I go to elements here, we can see our div there. It's empty. I'm going to click that. And now we can see our div in there inside of our structure. It's not, we can't see it on the page because it doesn't have any dimensions yet. And divs only take up the space that their content has. This doesn't have any content. So it's not going to display anything. But we can see it in the tree. So what we can do is if I, real quick, I'm just going to also, when I create the box, I'm going to console.dir the box so we can see what the box looks like, and maybe there's some properties on there we can use to make it visible on the page. Save that. We're going to refresh, make some boxes, check our console. We have a couple divs here. So this represents our div. So it's just an empty div element. This is sort of a, there's no ID because we didn't assign an ID. But a useful thing we can use is this style attribute. This is, again, just a property on the object. But inside of it are all the CSS styles that we can apply to that object. So we can do it programmatically, and we can apply things to this object. So we're going to use the border property, and then we can also use the height and width. I think it's in there. There's a height and width in there. So what we can do is we can reference the box object we just made. We can set box.style, again, just accessing that property. And then we want to go one deeper into the style object and find the height and width and border properties. So we can go border, set that equal to a string, 1 pixel, or we'll make it 5 pixels. This is CSS, the string. The CSS in here is, this is the CSS part of this, so I'm not really going to go super into it, but basically this is just a shorthand for making a border on an object, or on an element. And it's going to make a border that's 5 pixels thick, that's solid, and that's the color black. All right? And then we can also, but right now it has a border, but there's no dimensions to it, so we can also go box.style, height, and set that equal to 100 pixels. And do the same for the width. So now, if I save it and I run this again, we're going to get an error. Let's find out what happened. Save it. Probably. There we go, yeah. So we're making these divs now. They have a height and a width of 100. So this is fun, but we need to do something useful with this, like add some colors to it. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to put a function, we're going to attach a function to the actual object. So if we look in the div, remember we attached to the on click of the button, we can also attach to the on mouse move or mouse over. There's a couple different properties, a million not a million, but there's a lot of different events that you can attach a function to. So we have on mouse over or mouse move, this is going to fire a lot. It's going to fire every time the mouse moves over that element. So if we want to, when we make the box, we can attach another listener to each box, or attach a function to each box. So if we make the box dot on mouse move and set that equal to a function, the browser gives us something inside of these events. It passes something into these functions. So it passes in what's called an event object. It's another object. Again, a lot of things they're all just objects. It's another object that gives us some information about the event that just happened. So it gets passed into the function, but there's no way to reference it unless you have to capture it. So you have to pass something in here in between the parentheses as a parameter to capture that object so you have a reference for it. So most people just use the letter E. You can also just say event. You can really say whatever you want as long as you reference it inside the function as that. It will be the event object. So I'm just going to stick to event for now. And then on the mouse move, let me console log the event. Oops, console.log the event object, just so we can actually see what it looks like. So I refresh the page, make a box, click it. See, on the mouse move, I don't even see mouse. See how many times this is firing? It's a lot. These are all the things that just fired from me moving the mouse just for 2 seconds. So this event gets fired a lot. So it's kind of used with caution. Right now it's fine because there's only like 3 things on our page. But if you have a lot of things on your page and you're firing a lot of events, it's going to slow down. It's going to affect your performance of your application. So inside of the event object, see, it's a mouse event. Inside of the event object, we get a couple pieces of information which are useful. This X and Y are very useful. It's actually the same as this client X and client Y. What this is where the cursor was when the event happened. So when this event fired, this particular mouse event, not these other ones, but when this particular mouse event fired, the cursor was 113 pixels from the left-hand side of the screen, so from over this side, and it was 179 pixels from the top of the screen. All right, so it's telling us the position of the mouse when that event happened. So we can use that in our code in the event object just by referencing event.client X or client Y, or just X and Y, because it's easier. They're the same number. So inside of here, we could set the text, or actually I'll do this, the text, whoops, box.text content. And we'll set that equal to a string. And what the string is going to be is we're just going to have the X there. That's just a string I made. This is the label. And then we're going to concatenate it with the value of event.x. Right? And then we can add another plus to concatenate it with another string of y. And then we can add another plus and reference event.y. So every time the mouse moves, it's going to update the inside of these boxes, the text content of these boxes, with this string that we just built. So if we save it, refresh the page, make a box, and as I move the mouse around inside, you'll see it's changing those values every single time. Now this is all good and dandy, but it's not very nice to look at. So what we can actually do is take those changing numbers and set them to a different property. We can set them to the background color of the element. So I'm going to leave that text content in there. Actually, I'm going to make a new variable called RGB. And I'm going to set this to, this is going to be what's called a template literal, just because it'll be easier to construct. But it basically does the same thing as what we're doing right here, where we're adding in the different variables and it's concatenating it all. This is going to do that just in a more succinct way. So if we do RGB, and then anything in between this $, brackets is going to get evaluated as a variable. So RGB, and then we can just set event.x equal to that number. And then we can do another comma. So that'll be the red value of RGB. RGB is CSS, so that'll be the red value. The green value we'll set to event.y. And then the last one, we could set to another number, or we could just hard code 100 in there. And so the blue value will just stay at 100. RGB takes number values from 0 to 155 to determine the red, the green, the blue of the color that you're trying to make. So this is just building a string. And so instead of outputting that, I'm just going to output the string that we just built as the variable RGB. But then I'm also going to go box.style.background color. I'm going to access the background color property on the style object that's inside of our box. And I'm going to set that equal to our RGB variable also. So we can see in real time, if I save this and refresh it and put the boxes in there, when I mouse over, you'll see the RGB values changing, and you can mouse over and change the colors. And then these ones too, same thing. Now these ones at the bottom only stay green because if you look, the green is so high that it's over 255, so it's just doing max green all the time. So that's why this one can kind of change to like a darker blue and stuff, because the G is slightly lower. But then once you get up here, it's at like 400 and it just is maxing out the green.
Hey Ryan,
what's up?
Can I call back to something you said earlier?
Sure.
This is a perfect use case for Modulo Operator.
Modulo.
You mod that by 255. It'll give you the remainder, and you can always be changing.
Ah, let's try that out. So if we mod,
Because your event.x or your event.y is larger than 255.
right.
So if you just throw a mod 255 in there, it should allow that to change.
So we'll try that. Mod 255. Save that.
Definitely more than just for evens and odds.
Gotcha. Hey, nice. There we go. So we can also do that. We can use the percent sign in 255. So it takes whatever number is in here and it divides it by 255. And depending on the result, that's the number it puts in here. So it's actually putting in like, like 89, even though it should be like, 700 or 800 or something. That's cool. So that's that. And now we have these mouse moves. It's changing color. That's cool. Now, what if we want them to move? We can, again, we can add any CSS property we want. So if I go to Style and I add Animate class, this is a CSS class. Animate, yeah, it's just not being used yet. So this is a CSS class, and inside of it we can use what are called CSS transforms, which actually move the objects on the page around. So we can go transform, and then we can use what's called a translate. It's kind of tricky with there's like translate, transform, and transition, and it gets kind of tricky sometimes. But if you work with them enough, you just remember which does which. Transform is the property. Translate moves it on the page. So we'll translate X. We'll just say we want to move it 100 pixels. You could really do whatever you want in here. And then we will also use a rotate. This is why VS Code is so great, is you can just start typing something and it'll give you all the options you can use. So we'll just do rotate. Rotate takes degrees, so we can just specify any number of degrees we want. We'll just say 100 degrees. So we'll save that. So that's attached to the animate property. It's not doing anything in our JavaScript yet. So what we can do is we're setting the on mouse move property on our box. We could also set the on click like we did with the button. So we can go box.onClick, set that equal to a function. And then we don't need to pass in the event object because we're not really going to need it. So there was one other property on the box that we can use, this class list property. And the class list property, if you'll actually look at the _proto, it has all these different functions we can use to modify itself, actually. So we have add, contains, a lot of these different ones. We're going to use toggle. So if the value is present, it's going to take it away. If it's not present, it's going to put it in there. And we're going to use that with our animate class to toggle the animate class on and off on our function, on our elements. So we'll get a reference to the box again. And then we'll say class list. Again, we're just accessing that property. And then dot toggle. And then toggle is a function, and we just pass in the property that we want to toggle. And it's just a string. So I'll just say animate. So what this is actually doing, if I go over to elements here, I'll refresh the page. So if I add an element there, inside of our output we have that. That's all of our styles we're adding with the JavaScript. And I click it, we're going to get an error because toggle of undefined. There we go. I forgot capital L. I'm going to refresh. There is our div. When I click it, we're going to see a class animate popped onto it, and it moved. Now it just does it suddenly. It's not very smooth, but it moves it. It adds the class of animate, which applies these styles. It moves it 100 pixels to the right, and it rotates it 100 degrees. So a way we can add what we need to make it smoother is we need to add a transition to it. Now the transition property is another shorthand. It's like border. So you could use transition property to just specify the property. I'm going to use the shorthand. So transition, the first argument or first thing we pass to the transition property is the property we want to actually target. So I'm going to say transition, and we want to target this transform CSS rule, I guess it would be. Not really selector, it's a rule. So we would target that. Transform. The next thing is how long do we want the animation to run? I'm going to say 1 second. And then there's a timing function. We just set it to ease. There's a couple preset ones. So we'll just set it to ease. We'll save that. And now we create our box. It's going to animate it to the side. Now the only problem is that we're using the transition here to animate it. So when we apply the class to it, the CSS class animate, it's going to say, oh, this has changed. The transform has changed. I'm going to move it. Oh, but there's a transition on it, so I need to animate it, right? So it moves it. But then the second we click it again, it takes off the animate class. So we lose this transform. This goes back to translate 0 because the default is 0. We're not moving it anywhere. But then we also lose the transition, so it doesn't know to animate it, right? It works there, but then the second we take that class away, it doesn't know to animate it. So we can actually replace this with a property on the object, or on the element, the node, if you will. So we can, up here where we're applying the rest of our stuff, we can also just go box.style.transition, set that equal to the same thing we just specified here. So we can copy that, put it into there. Whoops. Oh boy. I'm just going to write it out again. So be transform, 1 second, ease. We'll save it now. So now this transition is set on the element. So it's there whether or not the animate class is there or not. So we can get rid of this. So now whenever the transform changes, it's going to know to animate it. Make another box. Now it animates there, and it animates back. So we can change it. Instead of clicking it, we could just set it to a mouse move. Now the problem is that we've also set the mouse move on the box. Or actually not mouse move. We can set it to mouse over. But actually, this demonstrates one of the drawbacks of assigning event handlers like this is that you can only really do one function per action or per event. So if I do mouse over, it'll work again, or it'll work like before, except instead of clicking, we can just hover over it and it'll work. Now, I'll bring this up. So we're using the mouse over. We're using these because we only have one function. But the problem is that we can only put one function on each of these properties on the object. So one of the ways around that is we can actually use what's called an event listener instead of assigning it here, because we could put all of our logic. We could combine two actions. Like say this is fine because we want to make a box, but say we want this button to also make some kind of network request or do something else on the page that isn't related to the box. We don't want to put all that functionality in one thing. We want to keep our functions kind of separate so they're easy to reason about and to manage. So we want to, instead of using just one big function that gets confusing after a while, we can use what's called an event listener. So an event listener is just a slightly different syntax, but the benefit is that we can put as many as we want on a particular object. At a certain point, you're going to run into problems with that because, again, they also eat up performance, but it helps to sort of delineate or keep them separate. So I'm going to say box.add. This is another function that the browser vendors give us. We can add an event listener. Now, event listeners take two arguments. The first one is just a string that specifies the type of event. So we can say click, or more importantly, we could say mouse over. Notice there's no on there, it's just mouse over. The second argument is a function we can pass in. Remember before when I was talking about how functions can take other functions, can wait to execute them later? This is what I was talking about. So we can pass in what's called a callback into our event handler that will do the same thing. It will toggle this animate. We'll just take that functionality and put it there. And now we can get rid of that. And we'll save, refresh, and now the same functionality, we mouse over using our event listener. Now the last thing we want to add is, because these are all getting stacked up in a vertical line, I want them to kind of be gridded out, so we can use Flexbox for that. So outside of our onClick function, so this is outside of our button function. So that's where we assign that. So all that was inside of, all this happens when we click our button. It's all inside this function. Outside of it, I'm going to apply some styles to the output tag, because that's the parent element of the all these divs. So I go output.style again, and what was it? Display, and we set that equal to the string flex, and then so if we just do flex, the one flex, display flex, it's all going to put them all in a row, and they're just going to keep getting smaller like that, which is kind of fun actually, but it's fun to just try to break your browser. But what I want them to do is I want them to wrap around. So we can use another property called flex wrap. So .style .flex wrap. We're going to set that to wrap. Save that. Get rid of the console. And we can just click this button a bunch of times. And now we get a bunch of colorful boxes that move and do all kinds of fun stuff. And we can change these to anything we want. We can make it rotate. You can make it rotate 1,000 degrees if you want. And it'll get all crazy and spinny. So you can do that if you want. You just got to keep clicking the button. But you could, I was actually messing around with this earlier today. It's almost like a game, because it's like you got to try to figure out, like, get them all back to just sit there. Like, it's really hard. Like, it's pretty fun. So that's a fun experiment to do. Are there any like questions, or anybody unclear of anything? No? Okay. Well, that was my intro to JavaScript course. So thanks, guys.